Morning, or whatever your local time is. This will be my first recording post speaking to somebody in the morning. Um, I was told that there is a theory of conversation and self which incorporated the idea that um, if you were to write or express yourself before speaking or interacting with other people, you were a pre social self. And the same was true with post speaking with people. It's very strangely minimally different, in my opinion, but it also varies from person to person. Um, the way that you see yourself, it's fundamentally challenged, but I heard him awake. I'll cut that out. The way that you see yourself is fundamentally challenged by your core beliefs uh, and the way that society impacts you, because by and large most people only understand who they are based off of where they are and who is around them. Therefore, a sense of self-worth is largely dependent on who you end up surrounding yourself with, which tends to be like-minded individuals. The problem lying therein is if the like-minded individuals are also self-defeating, because you'll end up forming together in what could be described as, say, a pity party, um, where it's a very unhealthy cycle of people who are in an unhappy position and dragging one another down because they don't feel they deserve anything but the bonds that they forged with the people that they consider to be their peers, which are the people that they consider to be like-minded, because they are either closed-minded or do not wish to fly so close to the sun as to attempt to surround themselves with what one could consider higher quality people. And that's understandable, but it's also a more immature mindset, in my opinion, which is nothing necessarily inherently wrong with that, as long as people are self-reflecting properly. The self is a very intimate thing, and a lot of people in this day and age are willing to share more of themselves than maybe they should, but they feel it's alright as long as it's within their caste system or their clique or their peer group. Once again, nothing inherently wrong with that. It ends up being when people don't know the dangers of oversharing that things can become a problem, or if their innermost secrets are darker than they had imagined, if they end up making people try and stay to promises that the other person didn't realize what they were signing up for at the time. This is why you're never supposed to quote unquote gamble with more than what you're willing to lose in terms of anything, really. Human interaction is a thing that time itself is a bargaining chip. Um, More often than not, people are only willing to lose what they have to, so you're forced to spend time together with certain people. Um, and more often than not, people uh, have closer bonds with people who are either mysterious because they spent time physically next to somebody but never outside of that, or they're a person who is damaging If a person is damaging, they end up sticking out in your mind exponentially more than someone who is seemingly inherently neutral, or in some cases good, because their flashbulb memories exist. I probably mentioned that before, but concept is the more pain a person is in, the stronger memories are formed throughout their life, and the more grounds they have for basing things in their version of reality. Pain is a thing that, pain and fear, two of the strongest motivators for most humans. I personally have a problem where I basically ignore pain for the most part, at least physical pain. Emotional pain I try to avoid like the plague, but lately I've been trying to confront it more and more headlong, because I feel that that is the key to my personal growth, is taking the things that I used to think were the worst things that could possibly happen to me and making them happen, so that I could realize the world still goes on. It's not as terrifying as people would say. Now, I don't necessarily recommend anyone else follow in my footprints unless they have the correct checks and balances in place, perhaps some sort of professional to guide them. I've been exceptionally lucky throughout my entire life, even in the worst of situations. My worst situations pale in comparison to some people's worst situations or worst ideas. Mostly because I've been lucky. Mostly because I don't believe physical pain can stop me personally, but a lot of people are starting to adapt that mindset, but believe that stress is a physical entity that can kill you, and if they believe in it, it makes it real enough that it can kill them. The people that don't believe that stress can hurt you are far more likely to not be hurt by it, as it turns out. It's kind of like the placebo effect, but somewhat in reverse. The demon that you do know versus the demon that you don't. That doesn't even apply here, but you get the concept. Abusive relationships, the demon you do know versus the demon you don't know. Let's tie that in. More often than not, people are much more willing to accept a person with all their flaws, even if they are an extremely damaging person, because it is familiar. The longer you spend with somebody, the more likely they are willing to keep you in their life, even if you're the worst person that they can imagine, because you are, quote unquote, precious to their life. Even if you are seen as a destructive force, oftentimes that makes people want you around that much more. Because it's hard to let go. Because they feel if they let go of that part of their past and allow themselves to move on, then they're going to be forgetting their past, which isn't true. There is nothing in this world that can take away your past, your memories, your fears, aside from time. And the idea that you are going to coat yourself in rose-tinted sunglasses looking upon the past. You'll look at even the worst of times with nostalgia, sometimes end up drawing yourself back towards things that would be considered damaging, for the sake of trying to recapture the novelty of childhood. This is why emotionally manipulative partners tend to exist, because they had an emotionally manipulative childhood or parenting. What else? So, the central premise that I've been just thinking is, let's see, the self. We've gone over identity. What do you identify as? Do you identify as what others see you as, or what you should see yourself as? And it's hard to define who you are if you don't have other people to define what your differences in the world are. But like, how do you know who is actually truthful and who is bringing up pain that shouldn't necessarily be dredged up? Is that type of pain more or less fair, more or less true? Everyone in this world must experience some pain or another, to the point where people are more willing to sacrifice themselves so that others don't have to experience pain, but then they end up creating a situation where that person was sheltered from the world and they know how to function in it. It's quite sad, really. But the extreme opposite end is people that have done such damaging acts upon people so that they are also functionally unable to exist in the world as we know it, and would take much of their life to rehabilitate them towards society if it were even possible. So in one instance you have basically princesses, and in the other instance you have basically what people would consider quote-unquote the insane. And then you could also even argue that these two groups are relatively similar to one another. It's like the insanity that can be associated with innocence in this day and age. It's insane to be openly trusting of strangers because that gets you killed if you're not careful, and more people don't know to be careful. And then you've got people that trust nobody and end up circling the drain until they get to one person and they realize that they have no choice but to trust in a single person. And if that person ends up betraying them, guess what? They're probably going to commit suicide. Because what do you have in this world? And this world is comprised primarily on experiences, associations. You could argue memories, but those are just experiences. So associations, emotions, logistical philia. What word am I looking for? Any qualia. Logistical qualia, so that you can potentially A plus B equals C. So this is why people end up forming illogical conclusions, because they've never known that any language exists outside of A plus B equals C. People on the whole are really simple, actually. They're one of the most tenacious groups of animals in this world. Also one of the most fragile. But I guess everything is really fragile if it's a organic being. Because if you know where the weakness lies, you can take advantage of it, as people who seek power oftentimes will. They'll seek to take advantage of weaknesses and try and prove themselves the victor, the stronger, because it's implied that if they know where the weaknesses are and they exploit them, that they do not have any, which is a logical fallacy that humans just push upon one another for no observable, discernible, or otherwise reason, as a way of coping mechanisms. The way the world works, your brain is highly equipped to be able to cope with a large series of various and sundry different things that can happen. It doesn't really have every answer, and there are a lot of things that happen in this world that humans shouldn't have to ever experience, but they do, and they can somehow get through it with relative normalcy on the other end, and it's by and large thanks to the fact that they had really good coping mechanisms. But different coping mechanisms can end up leading people to even more dangerous situations than the ones that they started in to begin with. You can go from, oh, I don't like the way people talk to me, to drug use in a matter of months. It's negative reinforcement, positive reinforcement, taking away something that somebody wants to try and force them to behave versus giving something somebody wants to make them behave, or what more people would classically say is negative reinforcement is a bad version of reinforcement, which is, once again, arguably worse. Got Pavlovian style responses to specific actions. You hear a belt, you shiver in fear because you think the belt is coming for you. You hear, I don't know, table leg scrape across a table, you duck under a table. Or, in the opposite end, you hear a refrigerator open, you start salivating. Very basic premises. But the human mind is largely able to be conditioned, and is largely conditioned by what you experience. And what you experience is typically narrowed down to what you enjoy until you start to look introspectively and quote-unquote self-actualizing, where it ends up becoming, how can I broaden my horizons? How can I be more than I am now? How can I expand what it is to be me? How can I more appropriately grasp humanity on the whole? Because humanity is largely about shared experience. Probably forgot to mention that earlier, but the reason that people do coexist is because they share an experience together, and that is how camaraderie is formed. If you share an experience together, you're much more likely to retain bonds with people than with people that you see and find visually appealing. This is why dating is a concept. This is why people who are physically close to one another in classes tend to have more draw for one another than people who are 20 feet away and don't talk. This is why people who are socially withdrawn have a vicious cycle of probably never speaking to somebody, because after a while they realize that they consider themselves invisible, so they sit at the back of the class next to nobody on purpose because they want to remain invisible, and doing otherwise would compromise their identity. But stepping slowly outside of your comfort zone, speaking softly, being unafraid of who you are, being unafraid of what others may think. These are the steps that you need to accomplish to be able to start moving forward as a human, as opposed to staying in place. And I can understand the comfort of wanting to stay still. This is thousands of years of evolution that we're trying to say, hey, it's much more comfortable to sit. It's much more comfortable to lay down. You burn less energy that way. But comfort is not how people progress. People progress because they're made to be uncomfortable in various and sundry different ways, whether it's, if you choose to make yourself uncomfortable, you feel like you have a much more strong purpose to it than if somebody else were to force you to become uncomfortable. But I feel it is always worth challenging the notions that you think. It's always worth checking to make sure that what you believe is what you believe. It is a necessary part of human evolution, I guess you could call it. In this day and age, if we physically don't evolve, but our brains are much farther along than our bodies, and we need to acknowledge this and make use of these facilities we have. We have very much at hand. We have the ability to do a lot. but we need to be willing to reach out. We need to be willing to try.